Good morning, everyone. Today I will be presenting my formal article presentation on escaping the effects of the Civil War for African Americans in Jacksonville. Let's start by getting into the concept of my paper. During the course of the Civil War and after the Civil War, Jacksonville was a focal point of both conflict and change for African Americans. The Civil War was the catalyst for constitutional changes. However, it did not come without casualties. The Reconstruction era made the impossible possible for Black people adapting into a white society. And lastly, the Duval County school system would also extend the effects of the Civil War for far too long. The effects of the Civil War left long lasting impressions on America. In this article, I delve into the effects of the Civil War on African Americans in Jacksonville, Florida. The American Civil War was fiercely fought over the issue of slavery. It was between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy, and this war would last for 4 years between the years 1861 to 1865. The Union wanted to abolish slavery, whereas the Confederacy wanted to expand and maintain slavery. The war resulted in many casualties. Families were devastated, as well as the land being destroyed. This also resulted in a strained economy. Ultimately, the war would end when Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general, would surrender the Confederate Army to commanding general of the Union, Ulysses S. Grant, and this was before his presidency. And this is what marked the end of the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 was done by President Abraham Lincoln, and the purpose of this was to free the slaves that were under the Confederate South. This did have limitations. So it was targeted to rebelling states in the South. However, border states were not included in this. Although this document did have limitations, it did give fuel for African Americans throughout America, and this was the first time they could really potentially see a future without slavery. And for the first time ever, African American men were allowed in the Union's military, and so this really gave them a purpose when they were fighting in this war. So a lot of African American men would help join the Union to fight the Confederates. And 2 months before Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated, he commented on the proclamation and said, "It is my greatest and most enduring contribution to history of the war. It is in fact the central act of my administration and the great event of the 19th century." So the Emancipation Proclamation really laid the foundation for the permanent abolition of slavery in America. However, Abraham Lincoln realized that without the Civil War, this document would have no basis. So he started working on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which we'll get into. After the Union won the Civil War and African Americans were free and they're back into society, Jacksonville underwent a significant transformation socially and economically. So formerly enslaved people who lived in Jacksonville, for the majority, they stayed in Jacksonville, and a lot of enslaved people who were once slaves came to Jacksonville because economically Jacksonville was booming, especially with the integration of African Americans into society. More people were working, more people were contributing to society, so economically it was great. However, a lot of new development and businesses were focused around the interest of white people. So the government would install a federal program of Reconstruction, and this was called the Reconstruction era. And the purpose of this was to improve conditions for African Americans in the South. And during this, African American people achieved remarkable advances in Black schools, Black businesses were developed, political representation in the community. Black people were being elected to positions in local government. However, white people remained resistant to the idea of this integration. One example of this is the sheriff's department. The black community would criticize the sheriff's department for the lack of minority officers and their overly harsh responses involving black people. During the Reconstruction era, a pivotal point was when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. So the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, which affirmed that anyone born or naturalized in the United States is an American citizen, including African American people. And finally, the 15th Amendment prohibited denying any citizen the right to vote based on the citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Another effect of the Civil War was the white reluctance to accept black community in the Duval County schools. Many African Americans were pursuing their education for the first time after previously being denied. The Staten Institute, now known as Staten College Preparatory School, which is still here in Jacksonville, Florida today, was the first and only public secondary school during this Reconstruction era. So many emancipated slaves would travel to Jacksonville for educational opportunities. The roots for legalized school segregation can be traced to the post-Civil War Reconstruction. Florida was under Republican control, and under this control, they passed a law requiring equal accommodations and allowing but not mandating integrations of school. However, shortly after that, a judge would nullify this law. And in response to that, Florida legislature passed a new law that required segregation of schools. That was done under the condition that impartial provision was made set for both schools, making sure like each schools were treated equally, even though they were not. This is when the NAACP began a nationwide campaign advocating for the desegregations of schools. This campaign fueled the Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court ruled that the segregation of schools denied black students of equal opportunity and therefore unconstitutional. And here in Jacksonville, Florida, Mims versus Duval County School Board, a judge would order immediate desegregations in schools. This resulted in the closure of several Duval County schools almost 20 years after the rest of America's schools were already desegregated. In conclusion, African Americans navigated the effects of the Civil War through adaptation and resilience. Black people made great strides from being slaves to being able to fight for freedom and eventually integrating into society. The Emancipation Proclamation paved the way to freedom, making space for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the Reconstruction era was a difficult time for the city. However, it was filled with many firsts for African Americans. While the journey to equality continued, the post-Civil War era allowed for growth, marking a pivotal chapter in Jacksonville's history. Here is my one-pager, and thank you guys all for watching.